On the morning of December 7th, 1941, in Honolulu, Hawaii, 22-year-old Cornelia Fort was fully engaged in her passion. She was airborne, instructing a student pilot in a vibrant blue and yellow Interstate Cadet, a popular training aircraft. Just as they were about to land, she instinctively seized control of the plane from her student to steer clear of an incoming Japanese military aircraft. The U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor was under an unexpected assault. Cornelia likely became one of the first people to comprehend the gravity of the situation on that serene Sunday morning. Born in 1919 in Nashville, Tennessee, Cornelia was the daughter of a physician and a successful businessman who founded an insurance company. She grew up on a sprawling family estate with 3 older brothers and a younger sister, developing a spirit of adventure that was not always favored in young girls of her time. Throughout her youth, Cornelia grappled with her identity and purpose until she ultimately discovered her true calling in aviation. Despite his aversion to risk, her father had made it clear to his 3 sons in 1924 that they were never to fly an airplane. This was only a couple of decades after Orville and Wilbur Wright had achieved human flight in 1903, capturing the imagination of both men and women and giving rise to the aviation industry, which would continue to grow exponentially. By the time Cornelia was 5, she had heard her brothers promise their father they would steer clear of flying. However, Dr. Fort never considered extending that same expectation to Cornelia. Cornelia's teenage years were challenging. As a tall girl, she felt out of place, loathed high school dances, and dreaded her impending debut into Nashville society. Although her father mapped out her educational journey, Cornelia pleaded to attend Sarah Lawrence College, a liberal arts institution in Bronxville, New York. After completing a year at a junior college in Philadelphia that her father had chosen, he finally relented, allowing her to enroll at Sarah Lawrence. During her 2 years at Sarah Lawrence, Cornelia reveled in the cultural opportunities available in nearby New York City, enjoying restaurants and museums. In 1939, she earned a 2-year diploma but resolved not to return for further education. Instead, she returned home to Nashville to contemplate her future. In the winter of 1940, she accompanied a friend to a local flight school for an airplane ride, an experience that would ultimately shape her destiny. Flying above Nashville liberated her, solidifying her desire to be a pilot rather than a mere passenger. By the summer of 1940, Cornelia had obtained her private pilot's license. Following the death of her father in March 1940, she felt emboldened to pursue her aviation dreams, even though her mother disapproved. She dedicated herself wholeheartedly to her new profession and soon acquired her commercial pilot's license, eventually becoming a flight instructor. She began teaching in Nashville while applying to various flying schools across the country. An opportunity arose in Fort Collins, Colorado, and she seized it, but it was a brief stop before she accepted a position in Honolulu, Hawaii, at a flight school where she would train sailors and defense workers on flying. By June 1941, the U.S. Army Air Corps had transitioned into the U.S. Army Air Forces as the threat of war loomed following Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 and its occupation of several Western European nations. Great Britain was valiantly defending its sovereignty against the Axis powers, and President Roosevelt, along with many others, believed that the U.S. would soon intervene to protect freedom. In late September 1941, Cornelia settled into an apartment in Waikiki, just a few miles from the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In a letter to her brother Dudley, she lamented about the high cost of living, noting that butter was selling for 67 cents per pound. On December 7, 1941, the skies around Pearl Harbor were filled with approximately 7 to 8 small civilian aircraft, with some larger military planes expected to arrive that day, leading to initial confusion over radar blips. Cornelia's swift assessment of the unfolding crisis and decisive maneuvering to avoid the Japanese planes were extraordinary, especially for a young pilot. After safely landing, she learned that another flight instructor had tragically been killed while fleeing with a student on the runway, and 2 civilian aircraft were lost that morning. Civilian aviation was immediately grounded, and Cornelia found herself out of work. It would take months for her to return to Nashville due to restrictive travel measures on the island. Upon her return, she resumed her role as a flight instructor. On September 6, 1942, she received a telegram from Nancy Love, inviting her to report to Wilmington, Delaware, to be considered for the newly established Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, AFS. Without hesitation, Cornelia traveled to Delaware, becoming the second candidate to arrive for evaluation, and was ultimately accepted as one of the originals, the first female pilots tasked with ferrying military aircraft across the United States. Tragically, Cornelia Fort lost her life in an airplane accident over Texas on March 21, 1943, while en route from Long Beach, California, to deliver a military plane to Love Field in Dallas. She was the first female pilot to die in service to her country. Although the WAFs and the later Women Air Force Service Pilots, WSP, formed in July 1943, lacked military status during World War II, they were finally recognized as military veterans in 1977. Cornelia Fort's life offers timeless lessons. Her bravery, intellect, patriotism, resilience, and zest for life continue to inspire. As for the other civilian aircraft on December 7th, an Aeronca 65TC rented by Huilili Club, with flight instructor Guy Nathan Tommy Tomberlin, 26, and club student James Duncan, had just rounded the northern headland of Oahu and was headed over land toward Lae when the bullets began to fly. The pair was about 25 miles north of Pearl Harbor, and Tomberlin would later note the time of that first attack in his logbook, 7:52 a.m. The first sign of trouble was two streams of tracers that converged on the bright orange trainer from behind. Tomberlin, who was in the rear seat, took control and snapped the Aeronca into a descending left bank toward the sea, jinking as the plane lost altitude. Bullets punched fist-sized holes in the Aeronca's rear fuselage and vertical stabilizer and sheared two longerons. Tomberlin and Duncan escaped with their lives, but only just. Just after the initial attack, two more fighters broke from an 11-ship formation and fired on the Aeronca, but scored no additional hits and quickly rejoined their formation to attack their military target. Tomberlin, now over water, flew just above the waves, heading southeast, and decided to sneak through Poly Pass and return to John Rogers Airport. Back at John Rogers Airport, just south of the battleships that were at the top of the Japanese target list, local attorney Roy Vitausek and his son, Martin, 17, were circling the airport at about 800 feet in an Aeronca TC-65 rented from Gambo Flying Service, one of 3 flight schools that had been established on the airfield to provide instruction under the civilian flight training program. The owner of that school, Marguerite Gambo, was teaching a student in a Myers OTW biplane, flying near another Japanese target, Kaneohe. Plumes of smoke rising from Kaneohe made it clear to Gambo that the warplanes were not American, and her airplane was buffeted by turbulence as fighters pulled up from their strafing run. The fighters did not engage the biplane, however. Gambo, whose encounter was most likely the basis of one depicted in the 1970 film Tora Tora Tora, albeit with the wrong aircraft, a Stearman used in the film, turned and raced toward John Rogers Airport. Others were not so fortunate. A pair of Piper Cubs departed John Rogers at 7:40 a.m. and headed first northeast, flying just off of Waikiki Beach toward Diamond Head before turning west, bound for Camp Malakol on the other side of the island. That was where soldiers of the California National Guard, 251st Coastal Artillery Regiment, were based at the time. The Cub pilots, as well as a passenger on one of the aircraft, were all members of that unit. Sergeant Henry C. Blackwell and Corporal Clyde C. Brown had both been taught to fly in their off-duty hours by Robert Tice, co-owner of KT Flying Service, another of 3 civilian schools then based at John Rogers Airport. Sergeant Warren D. Rasmussen had come along for the sightseeing excursion. Tice and his wife Edna, meanwhile, arrived at the airport not long after the 2 Cubs departed, and minutes before fighters began to strafe the field. Tice, standing next to his wife on the ramp, was hit in the head during the first moments of the attack and killed instantly, the first of 68 civilians struck down. The soldiers he had trained were flying about 2 miles offshore, at around 500 feet, headed toward their base. The Vitoseks were circling overhead, having returned from their own sightseeing. Another instructor, Cornelia Fort, was flying in an Interstate S-1A cadet with a local student. a defense worker named Sumala. The cadet was approaching John Rogers Airport to practice touch and goes. A sailor aboard a Navy tugboat, whose account was included in a Honolulu Star Bulletin story published December 20th, 1941, and later repeated, with minor variations in detail, in a sworn deposition, recalled seeing the two yellow cubs flying offshore at about 500 feet when Japanese aircraft pounced on the flight. There were 7 enemy warplanes in the newspaper account, several reported in the sworn deposition. One cub plummeted straight into the ocean, while the other circled for a moment before also diving into the water. Only fragments were ever found. The incoming Japanese would have come up on them at probably 200 miles per hour, approaching from the right side. If they saw anything before they were killed, it was tracer fire. Vitusek chose a different tactic rather than scurry to land. They climbed. The Japanese were very focused on what they were doing. Once they realized that, they got out of the way. Accounts differ about whether the Vitusek's rented Aranka ever took damage. According to some, bullets did cut through the Aranka's fabric. The museum on Ford Island later restored the aircraft and uncovered evidence of past fabric repair. There was also the now debunked story of another Pearl Harbor mystery, that of a sailor named M.F. Poston, who, according to a military report, said he bailed out of another Piper Cub after fighters attacked him, along with Tice, over the Poly Pass at 6,000 feet. It was thought that the story was concocted to explain Poston's unauthorized absence on December 7th. There is no evidence to support it, and a great deal of evidence that Tice was on the ground when he was shot and killed. That leaves 7 civilian aircraft accounted for on December 7th, 1941. One civilian plane a lot of people overlook was the Pan Am Clipper that was on its way into Pearl Harbor. The flight was due to arrive at 8:30 a.m. during the middle of the attack, but was 45 minutes behind schedule. The pilot had attended his daughter's piano recital the night before and got a late start on the flight. Never was an airline delay more welcome, as it turned out. The inbound Clipper learned of the attack in progress by radio, and they diverted to Hilo. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I have plenty of similar stories on my channel. If you have a thought on the civilian aircraft or pilots at Pearl Harbor, leave a comment below. Don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons on the way out.